All right, this is the 20th century. Our first board here is our topics, 20th century, Unit 6. Our essential question, how did World War I bring the whole world into an industrialized era? So let's talk about World War I. So that's where we begin this unit. Imperialism and the industrialization of Europe set the stage for Europe to delve into a war. So one of your classmates came up with this, which isn't something new, but found it on the internet. Nevertheless, this is an acronym, MANIA. Some of the reasons that led up to World War I: militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and then assassination. The 5 causes of World War I, with the spark coming from the killing of Archduke Franz Ferdinand from Austria-Hungary. So remember, Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne when he was killed by the Black Hand from Serbia. Obviously that wasn't a good thing, and Austria-Hungary government wanted to go into Serbia. Serbia said, help us, Russia, and then Russia came to the aid of Serbia, and that then got the other alliances involved, which all started in World War I. So once the war started, there was an old German general by the name of Schlieffen, and the Schlieffen plan, German plan to take out France, because Germany had to fight on 2 fronts, and then move on to Russia. And this almost worked. They got within 40 to 50 miles of Paris before they had to be turned back. Now, war settled into a war of attrition from the trenches, where old school tactics versus new day industrial weapons. So you had the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, versus the Allied powers, France, the British, and Russia, which would pull out of the war, and then the United States came into the war. United States was neutral to begin with, then due to the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, where quite a few Americans died, and then the Zimmerman Telegram, which the United States then joined the Allies in the spring of 1917 to fight in the war. Now, World War I, staggering amount of deaths, 8 to 9 million soldiers, 20 million civilians were killed. The Treaty of Versailles, which was signed in 1919, forced Germany to take the blame, and crushing concessions as well as payment in war reparations, which they just paid off like in 2010 or something like that. President Wilson, the President of the United States, came up with the 14 points which would provide for future peace, but this wasn't well liked. And then he tried to set up the League of Nations, which the United States never agreed to. And the League of Nations was kind of weak, so it didn't actually work so well. All right. During the same time period, the Russian Revolution, Nicholas II was the Tsar. He reigned from 1894 to 1917. Russia lost the Russo-Japanese War in 1905, which wasn't good for Russia, and then had to defend his right to rule from within the own country in a bloody uprising named Bloody Sunday. Next 10 years, from 1905 to roughly 1917, was not good for the government. It was very tumultuous, a lot of backlash. In February of 1917, the Tsar was forced to resign. Russia set up a provisional government, Duma, with some heads of the departments or states, and this obviously did not go very well as well. By 1918, Soviets by the name of the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, took over and withdrew Russia from the war. The Red Army, then led by Leon Trotsky, was able to put down a civil war. So from 1918 to roughly 1922, there was the White Army and the Red Army, and they were constantly fighting in a civil war, and eventually the Red Army would win, which would lead to the Bolshevik ruling power. Lenin didn't rule for very long. By 1926, the USSR, the United Socialist Social Republic, USSR, did I say that right? Probably not. All right, is growing strong and industrializing under new leadership of Joseph Stalin. He comes up with a new economic policy, the 5 years plan. Under Stalin's rule, millions were killed for standing up to communism and to Stalin, and so this was not a good time in Russia's history. Now, the Ottoman Empire, since it had aligned itself with the Central Powers and they lost during World War I, the Ottoman Empire is disbanded after losing World War I. Mustafa Kemal becomes the father of Turkey, and he overthrows the Sultan and secularizes the mostly Muslim nation. Shortly after this, into the 1920s, the Great Depression begins to take over most of the world. World War I was super expensive. The United States became the center of world banking since European economies were in a shamble. The stock market crash in New York City in 1929 sent shockwaves around the world, and it really did affect everybody. The United States and Germany were the hardest hit in the early 1930s, with at some point, a third of the population in these countries were out of work. FDR is elected President of the United States in 1932 and begins to rebuild. Now, while this was taking place, FDR was rebuilding under a democratic government in the United States. There was the rise of fascism in the European countries. Mussolini begins to rise in Italy in the early 1920s. He's got the black shirts, very militaristic. Italy was nationalistic, militaristic, and began to also move and try to take over parts of North Africa. At the same time, in Germany, Hitler begins to rise. He opposed the democratic Weimar Republic, which was established after World War I. The Nationalist Socialist Party, or Nazi Party, began to rise and planned a takeover of the Reichstag, which is the German Congress. In the early 1920s, the Nazis began to rise, but it wasn't until the early 1930s that the Nazi Party actually took control of the German government. Now, Hitler's fascist rule, the Third Reich, was militaristic and crushing to most minorities. Hitler began to try to get land back that was lost in World War I, land in Austria, Czechoslovakia. People from other European countries were forced to sign appeasements to try to, make Hitler happy so he wouldn't, go crazy and take over the entire continent. These appeasements obviously ended up not working. This was signed in the Munich Conference in 1938, and then Hitler signed the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact in August of 1939, essentially saying, Hitler was saying, I won't attack you, Soviet Union, if you don't attack us. And this just set the stage for, war. War is looming. Meanwhile, out in the Pacific, Japan, the Depression affected the Japanese as well. Japan begins to become much more militaristic as well. They still had an emperor, but the military had most of the power. Japan was an allied force during World War I and felt they should have gotten more land after World War I, and they were quite upset about this, especially German colonies or German land that was taken away from Germany in the South Pacific and in China. Japanese felt entitled to that land or colonies, and they got nothing. 1937, Japan takes it upon themselves to invade China. So this is all leading up to now World War II, which is going to be our next boards. So remember, history's no mystery. Take good notes.